Right. Yeah, thanks for the intro, Megan. Hi, everybody. I see a lot of familiar names out here. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I think this should fill up the 45 minutes or so that Megan said I was allotted, so it feels very generous. I feel like gives me some latitude to ramble and rant, so thank you for that. But I will try and keep things moving along. Um, yeah, so the I think the title got abbreviated. I'm not sure what it was, but it was I've abbreviated it in this presentation as well. But the main idea here is we're talking about coastal screech owls and old growth, BC old growth forests, and how those populations are, or at least within some of those old growth habitats, we have apparently healthier populations than most elsewhere in Pacific Northwest, at least in BC and Washington State. So yeah, I'm going to delve into how we found some of that out, what was the background, where we sort of got the ideas to start looking in some of these other habitats that hadn't been surveyed as much previously, and some general background about what screech owls do and their habitat associations, and some more speculative, fun stuff. We're just sort of thinking about hypotheses to test for some of our next, hopefully, future work for the species. So yeah, I've worked with Megan for the last couple of years on some of the more recent projects that we've done with PMRA. So just as a quick background on that, at Pacific Megascops Research Alliance, it's a volunteer-driven initiative that myself and Jeremiah Kennedy started back around 2021. And yeah, Megan's joined up with us, and we're sort of open to anybody and scientists or citizen science who are interested in supporting research conservation science to help us better understand screech owls and their habitat needs, factors affecting their population declines, and hopefully, yeah, their persistence, if we can figure out ways to manage habitat for that. So, yeah, I guess I'll launch right in. I guess the only other thing on the slide is my other hat that I wear is with Ausenco as a environmental consultant, and so that's my full-time job. So yeah, more on that in a little bit. I'll start though with land acknowledgement. So I'm actually situated right now in Vancouver, Washington, near the border of Washington State and Oregon State. So most of my work has been with screech owls in Canada, in BC in particular. A couple years ago, I moved down south of the border and currently located on the traditional territory of the Cowlitz Indian tribe. However, all the research and results you'll see presented here are in other areas. So there's a list of several places around the South Coast and Vancouver Island and nations whose territory we've worked on and that we'd like to acknowledge. So continuing on with acknowledgements, beyond the First Nations and their traditional territory, several groups and institutions and people helped support this work. So as I mentioned, Ausenco played a large role. So some of the funding that we got for the work has gone through Ausenco and has been conducted by myself and others there, and formerly Hamera. And that formerly was Hamera. That was, I guess, the initial work I did with screech owls was with the support of Jared Hobbs, who sort of led and was the first person to get me interested in working on the species. So yeah, big thanks to Jared and to Hamera and Ausenco for supporting this work. And a lot of it has also been funded by the province and Environment Canada. We have some collaborations with Birds Canada, which you'll hear more about in the presentation. The Comox Valley Land Trust helped support some surveys, and Wild Research also helped us recruit volunteers and supported with some ARU equipment. But the biggest supporters for the group were Habitat Stewardship Program. Sorry, I'm going to be looking like screen that showed up that I'm sharing is on the opposite side. So sorry if I'm looking the other way. So the Habitat Stewardship Program was the main funding source for the work that's being presented here. And that comes from the Environment and Climate Change Canada as a funding source and went through WESOke. So yeah, otherwise, this is a lot of the work was volunteer driven, like I said, by myself and others at Pacific Megascops Research Alliance. So getting into it with some background information, the Screech-Owl has several different species, but also subspecies within the Western Screech-Owl species. So there's a map, a range map here that you can get, I think, access to on Birds of the World online, which shows some of the current designations for populations and subspecies of the Western Screech-Owl. So the one subspecies of interest here for this study that we're discussing is the kennicottii, the coastal subspecies. There are two in BC, the other being McFarlane in the interior, with Megan worked on for her master's thesis. And then both of these subspecies are year-round residents, territorial, relatively small owls that are cavity nesting and nocturnal. As far as their ecology, they're a bit of a difficult species to pin down. They appear in lots of different habitat types, and depending on where they're at, can eat a range of different foods. So prey can range from insects to small mammals to even birds. And really, like I said, depends on where you're looking and what habitat they're in. So as you can imagine, just go back, the species is pretty well adapted to a lot of different environments as a whole. And even in this range, there are lots of different habitats that in the Pacific Northwest on the coast where they've been known. And traditionally in BC, over the past 15 years, up until I guess the last 5 years, most of the work that had been done with Screech-Owls had focused on these riparian, mixed deciduous coniferous valley bottom habitats. So that was where, in the 2000s and when I started working on the species in the mid-2010s, where a lot of the effort was being invested to track some of the Screech-Owls that were still around in the lower mainland, at least, but also on Vancouver Island, southern Vancouver Island. But that certainly is not the only habitat that they were known to exist in. And as I said, they are generalists. One of the interesting things I've seen is here around the Portland, Oregon area. So you can see in this map, this is an eBird screenshot from the years 2010 to 2020 of the map of detections. And these are all Screech-Owl detections around Portland, and even a couple in Vancouver, Washington. And here's where I'm looking at them from with my binoculars. So this is where my house is. But around the lower mainland in around Vancouver actually was historically, before 2000, there were tons of Screech-Owl sightings there as well. It was one of the most densely populated areas for Screech-Owls. So yeah, it can persist in a lot of different habitats, or historically it has. And you might even see it popping up on a boat. So this isn't their real habitat, but a good example of a very sort of different place from those. It's not urban, it's not a riparian. This is them off a rocky shoreline on a sailboat around the Gulf Islands. And this photo was taken of a chick by Jeremiah Kennedy's uncle. Was one of the moments and exposures to this awesome species that really got Jeremiah hooked on them. So yeah, obviously the San Juan and the Gulf Islands are very unique habitat as well. So drier, there's arbutus trees where they've been seen to nest within, which is different than maybe even a riparian habitat would have been a large big leaf maple or cottonwood. So it can be quite variable. Moving on to conservation status and trends. So, despite the fact that a lot of these areas were really heavily populated with Screech-Owls, and it was one of the most common owls observed in the south coast of BC, since 2012, conservation statuses have been sort of listed and then upgraded, leading to, in 2017, threatened designation under thru, which offers some legal protection to Screech-Owls, and has been sort of some of the impetus behind my working on the species. So a lot more funding has become available from Environment Canada. For instance, the Habitat Stewardship Program is set up to fund species at risk work. So if the species isn't listed, then that money wouldn't be available to support the work. So that has made a big difference in for my own work with the species, and has helped us, I think, learn a lot in the last several years. Also, blue listed in BC, although that doesn't carry any legal protection. And then in Washington State, they're listed as a species of greatest conservation need. So that's not any sort of formal listing status. That doesn't offer any protection. There's no federal status in the states either. But it does, similar to the SARA listing status, make them eligible for funding for research and monitoring. And the coastal subspecies was only recently listed for Washington State. Similarly, in BC, we're sort of tracking, several years behind them in terms of some of the population declines, but also the listing status. The interior subspecies in both areas have been listed, several years earlier. So the coastal subspecies that we're talking about here is some of those population declines hadn't been noticed or recognized as quickly. But yeah, I guess the final note here is that there is no legal protection for Screech-Owls under any sort of conservation status, at least in the States or Washington. So I got a couple of figures here that I'll kind of explain what led to those designations, which is mostly declines in detections. A lot of that from Christmas bird counts, but also supported from some survey work that Tanya Tripp and others did on Vancouver Island, and work that was done around Lower Mainland that sort of aligned with what was seen in the Christmas bird counts. But what this figure here shows, and this one's from a publication by Elliott in 2006. This is an example of some of the Christmas bird count data. So this is a figure focused on the Lower Mainland and Vancouver Island. And most of these records are going to be from where most of the people are. So sort of biased towards Southern Vancouver Island, but it does show a pretty clear trend, particularly from around 1990 through the early 2000s of declining detections on these Christmas bird counts, both in the Lower Mainland and Black and on Vancouver Island, to the extent that by the mid 2000s, getting very few detections overall. And this all amounts to between 1990, and if you carry this forward through to 2021, I think it's about a 30-year range, somewhere between 1990 and 2020, 2.1% decline annually for 30 years, which adds up to, really big population collapse, essentially, at least from these areas where those surveys were done. So additional information that we have from Washington State from the same data shows a similar trend. This is more broadly for Washington State as a whole, and we see the same from 1990 to the sort of mid-late 2000s in particular, a really steep decline in the number of detections. And this rate of decline in Washington State was actually even greater, 2.7 as opposed to 2.1% in DC. And so this led to those conservation status, listing status updates. They were listing in BC in Canada, and sort of led to like a bit of an inflection point as to like what can be done. So this is kind of when I started working with Screech-Owls. So Jared Hobbs and I worked on a contract to assess sort of what was the state of knowledge here. Now, once we were at the sort of super low densities, low detection rates, what could be done with that data? And we just it just sort of reaffirmed, sort of compiling all this information, that there wasn't enough information in the areas where people had been surveying them to really do any effective population trend analysis or habitat association, like any sort of statistically robust study was going to require, an absurd number of surveys and study sites to the point where it wasn't really gonna work. So we sort of reassessed to try and figure out what else could be done for the species. And one of the things that we recommended, based on some work that Jeremiah Kennedy did in 2016 for his undergraduate thesis, was to focus on maybe some, or at least take a look at some other habitats where that hadn't been studied as much and where potentially there were higher occupancy rates, so greater proportions of territories that are occupied compared to what we'd seen or what most of the data was showing and where most of that data came from. So yeah, Jeremiah in his 2016 work found somewhere around 60% occupancy in the Central Coast for Screech-Owls in this hypermaritime bog habitat. And yeah, so that was recommended to the provinces. Like maybe let's, rather than continuing to chase around the few remaining birds and around the south coast and southern Vancouver Island, not that isn't valuable work to be done there, but let's also sort of look what else we can see if there's other healthier populations maybe elsewhere. So extending off of that work, we identified some similar habitats on northern Vancouver Island that were a bit more accessible. And some surveys were done out there by Guy Monty and Bernard Schroeder for the province for several years. Well, I want to say 2 or 3 at least. So as you can see, the dark purple here, we're looking at biogeoclimatic zones, is the more to the area on the northern Vancouver Island. So that kind of tipped us off to the possibility of more Screech-Owls being there, at least checking it out. So the province went, to their credit, they supported this whole reassessment and sort of external request for recommendations for where to work, and then followed up with surveys there. So thanks to them and to Bernard and Guy. This area here, I think this is a photo from Bernard, shows just how similar these habitats can look between the Central Coast and northern Vancouver Island. So that was the area targeted. Yeah, we had, looks like 4 years of surveys were done on northern Vancouver Island there. Yeah, and happily we found really high occupancy rates. So 93 to 100% in the Nahwitti Bog, Shusharty around the south end of Shusharty Lake, upwards of 100% occupancy rates in some of these areas. It's basically everywhere that they surveyed, they found Screech-Owls. So that was great. And also some other areas, lower rates, but still 31, 36 to 58%. These are still higher than the less than 20% occupancy rates, and often less than 10% that we were finding around habitats that had been surveyed most around South Coast and Southern Vancouver Island. So after that, which was a good news story, it sort of led to the next question here, which was, are there any other habitats that sort of have been missed, essentially, at least recently, where folks really haven't been monitoring, and there might be other sort of pockets of healthier populations, higher occupancy rates. So we sort of combed the literature a bit and found a report from Tofino Creek from the 1990s showing really high Screech-Owl densities. So this figure shows a couple of different habitat types around Tofino Creek that were surveyed. On the y-axis here, we have the mean number of owl. There's a little typo in here. A lot of the report was, these guys also did a bunch of murrelet surveys, but this one was indeed owls, Screech-Owl, saw-whet, pygmy owl. And essentially they found that the Screech-Owl was the most common owl in this area. So that might not have been too different from the lower mainland, at that time in the early 90s, but definitely seemed worth following up on because didn't we didn't really have any other reports from that area more recently, apart from some incidental detections. People had seen Screech-Owls around, and there had been some roadkill, for example, on some of the roads around Tofino. So yeah, that was kind of our next launching point and sort of the impetus for and rationale behind a lot of the grant applications we submitted for HSP and that funded the subsequent work. So yeah, so that kind of brings us to this objective section. So framing this work we did for the Habitat Stewardship Program as the sort of main study that I'm presenting here. The objectives for that study were framed around the species recovery strategy. So, and a couple key points from that we really were honing in on. One being improving understanding of habitat associations, and importantly here to inform critical habitat designations. So one of the things that gets triggered with that threatened designation from 2017 is the need for the federal government to identify critical habitat for the species. So now that that was sort of in the works, and we had some evidence that there are some habitats that really weren't well represented within the data sets that were and have been used to create critical habitat. We started working sort of right away, even just volunteering, as that's kind of how the whole Pacific Megascops Research Alliance effort started. Was we didn't want to wait until we had funding. We needed to get this information as soon as possible to help inform the critical habitat designations. So most of our first year of work was just pure volunteer. And there's a picture there of Jeremiah out around the Southwark Kennedy Lake or Tofino Creek, one of our first surveys that he volunteered for. They did get an owl or two on that one, I think, before they hit a road closure or something. I'm not sure. At a certain point, that transect got shut down. But we got that guy out there, and anyways, besides the point. The other objective was to identify factors driving population trends. So one of those was increased presence of the range expanded barred owl. So there's some anecdotal evidence at that point and all sorts of evidence really. But one sort of key example that's often pointed to in literature for this is the study on Bainbridge Island in Washington State. So that's near the Seattle Puget Sound area, showing Screech-Owls on the upper panels. So these are all maps of the island and showing detections of the owls starting from around 1995 going through 2010. And you see the Screech-Owls sort of blinking out over time, whereas barred owls present in the lower panel. You see higher and higher densities and numbers of barred owls. So this was identified as one of the potential factors driving population trends, something to look at in our work. Another thing, having identified some old growth habitats that seem to be supporting Screech-Owls, it seemed like forestry and the loss of old growth habitats could potentially be playing a role as well. So forestry management practices as another potential driver. And the third objective or sort of recovery strategy objective we wanted to address was to identify factors influencing detection rates. So all the data I think I've presented so far are just detection data. It's essentially just the number of owls that were heard, maybe some of them seen, but mostly heard. And vocalization rates can fluctuate from place to place, year to year, over time. And one of the key pieces is first to understand whether or not the declines in detections are truly declines in abundance and population size, and then also to be able to account for that and come up with methods where you can track the population and account for differences in detection probability from place to place and from time to time to get a better understanding of what are the real population trends and differences in occupancy rates across habitat types. So there's a quote in here I have from the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. It basically says, part of the reason that they're not giving it a real proper designation is that they don't know if the declines in detections they've seen are related to fewer vocalizations or actual declines in the species. So it's the sort of data gap that can make a big difference in what sort of funding is available to look at the species and what conservation or what sort of legal protections even they have. So another important data gap to address. Fortunately, the BC side of things, this was identified already as a species at risk, so we didn't have to wait for that. Okay, I'm gonna try and speed up here, going too slow. So, okay, what did we do to address this? We did some ARU, which is bioacoustics work, and playback surveys, which is more traditional call for the bird, listen to the response. To address the detection probability issue, we did repeated surveys so we could get at each location an idea for how often they responded and have that to be able to account for changes and differences in detection probability. And we looked at 20 different areas across Vancouver Island and the South Coast. We targeted some of these historically surveyed sites to continue documenting what had been seen to date, and also some of these other old growth habitats. And so particularly focusing on more productive old growth systems like was seen around Tofino Creek and cedar dominated old growth systems in particular. Our methods, one of the main benefits of partnering with Birds Canada on this, several. So they've got, if folks aren't aware, Nature Counts is their sort of data management platform, and it also is an app that they have. So we work with them to develop an app for some of our playback data entry, so that data sort of feeds directly into their Nature Count system. We also worked on some ARU data processing methods, and there's a lot to talk about with ARUs, but suffice to say, these are remotely deployed recording units that listen for owls, and then you process the data later, and either in an automated way or manually go through and identify the owls in the sound files. So we used the ARUs in more remote sites where we couldn't do regular playback, and we overlapped the two as well there, so we could compare detection probability between the two methods, and that should allow us, and the idea is to use that so we can use these data sets together a little bit more seamlessly. So we also standardized a bunch of the methods. So one of the key points of that was standardizing spacing to 800 meters. So here's an example of an old growth productive cedar forest, ARU, 800 meters apart. So this was determined to be a good distance because some prior work had shown owls are generally only detected within 300 meters of call playback or ARUs. It's an efficient spacing for monitoring the area for occupancy models, and also aligned with the risk standards and the nocturnal owl survey standards that use 1600 and 400 meter spacing. So at least some of the data from each of these can all be used together. So yeah, that was, I think, valuable standardization. And here's a map of the areas where we surveyed. So we've got 20 sites, so it's really more of like a transect or route. So each of these dots represents a location where we had somewhere between 8 and 20 stations that were surveyed. The white dots represent stations that were just surveyed by ARUs, so the remote sensing technology. Red is the areas that were just surveyed by playback, and pink represents areas where we had overlap between the two methods. And actually, there ended up being some overlap on the Northern Island as well that the province did, but that wasn't done by us. And that data has been very valuable. So thanks again to Guy and Bernard for that work. So as you can see, there's two kind of regions here, the South Coast area. So I was sort of leading some of this work, and Jeremiah was coordinating most of the Vancouver Island work. And yeah, we ended up yeah, okay. So sorry, we're in our results section essentially here. There was supposed to be, there it is, survey effort and playback results. So we don't have the results from a lot of the ARU data still. The data processing step has created a backlog for us that we haven't worked through, but we do have the playback results. So the nice thing about playback is that, especially using the Nature Counts app, is the data is sort of immediately available and uh, online and ready for analysis. So that is sort of the results that we can look at right here. And that's mostly from 2023 and 24 already Nature Counts. And then we also have results from some prior years that didn't go straight into Nature Counts because the app wasn't ready yet, but we were able to look at. So what we found was on Vancouver Island, 30 to 50% naive occupancy. So without accounting for detection probability, which means the true occupancy would likely be more, as some of these locations that were surveyed we didn't hear owls, but there were likely owls at some of them. So, that's a low end estimate, 30 to 50%. And we often detected screech owls within these old growth cedar dominated forests, as we had suspected, and as the Tofino, the 1990s Tofino Creek study had shown. In the South Coast mainland, we did not have any screech owl survey detections, despite some records from some of the areas that were surveyed, like around Squamish and Pemberton 5 years prior. So I know Greg Ferguson and a bunch of collaborators out there, and did get several screech owl detections in like the mid 2010s, but we repeated some of those areas and didn't really pick up anything. So not to say that there's nothing there, but we didn't get any detections. And compared to what we saw in Vancouver Island in these old growth forests, there really were, essentially was night and day difference. We did have one visual detection around Coquitlam Lake, and we did get a whole whack of barred owls around the South Coast mainland. Plenty of barred owls around. So what do we think this all means? We think that probably reflects greater than 50% occupancy rates in these cedar-dominated old growth forests. And I should specify these are sort of the productive old growth forests. So there are cedar-dominated forests, in a bog, so there aren't that many trees. It doesn't really have the same feel to it, but those are also old growth cedar forests. But this is referring to these higher productivity forests that we were surveying for this HSP project. And we got records of screech owls that sort of confirmed in Tofino Creek that there was also continued occupancy, indicating, and sort of having that historical data, it shows us that this isn't like it's not as if these birds were pushed in this habitat, but this is a long-standing, these habitats have long-standing value and were used, from the 1990s, likely all the way up to now. And we suspect the same for the Northern Island and these other areas that were surveyed. So we think it's more that the areas just haven't been looked at as much, and not that birds have moved in there. We also, developed multi-method occupancy models. So we have the scripts all ready to run, and we vetted them that are able to pull together both playback and ARU data, and even make comparisons with those. And so, I think one of the sort of things I wanted to speculate a bit on was, what is it about these habitat types that screech owls that are helping them, persist? So they're pretty unique, but we've got some ideas about what we think, either, and a lot of this is around sort of safety from barred owls potentially, and also prey availability. So in these bog habitats, we found, for the most part, were absent of barred owls. You have the odd barred owl detection, but really low detection rates compared to, South Coast or Southern Vancouver Island, for example. So in the absence of barred owl, the screech owls seem to do well. There's also a lot of, amphibian and insect prey potentially here, which would be food for screech owls, but not as much for barred owls. So we suspect that, given how open the area is, that it's not necessarily like these open foraging areas provide unique food, and also that there are dense areas where it could provide safety for Screech-Owls from barred owls. And also you see these sort of dense understory in the productive old growth forest, which would make it more difficult for a barred owl to hunt on their preferred prey, which are some of those rodents that I'll show you. Flip to the next photo. Like one of these second growth forests with a open sort of closed canopy with those younger trees, like 60 to 100 odd years old, really fill up the canopy, block out the light, and leaves a really open understory, which we suspect makes for better foraging opportunities for the barred owl, which would perch here and have really easy access both to rodents, but also doesn't really provide much of safe, options or areas for Screech-Owls to hide. And also there could be not only hiding places, but lots of little, micro habitats and niches within that different insects and invertebrate prey can hang out. It's also a bit more insulation of this habitat within a old growth forest. So temperatures can remain more mild, and conditions can remain maybe more moist in the summertime for insects. So those are some of our speculations for why we think Screech-Owls can do better here. Another reason why this happens is the old growth forest being cedar dominated productive forests being or having greater structure. Basically it leads to these sort of openings in the canopy, which lets more light in, which allows for this greater undergrowth. And I've also seen some reports from some work that Sophie Heinmark did around the South Coast showing that areas where Screech-Owls are persisting are in some of these riparian valley bottom habitats are characterized by dense understory growth of salmonberry and similar sort of looking situation where there's cover for a Screech-Owl and potentially safety. We think potentially there can be some overlap even of the two species. So in an area where there's sufficient nesting habitat and food for both species and areas for Screech-Owls to hide and forage away from barred owls, or at least in features of the forest that barred owls can access, there is potential for some coexistence of the species, persistence together. So here's just another example of a forest with an open understory that might be better for barred owls with a younger, obviously not old growth forest, and some of the features that we see in an older forest with snags and protection around a creek that we know Screech-Owls seem to forage a lot on invertebrates and even fish. I'm sure Megan can tell you all about that. Crayfish and just fish. So let's just wrap things up here since we're about out of time. What's the follow-up work we've done? So we do have more, there's more playback survey data that we've compiled into the Nature Counts BMDE format. That's bird monitoring data exchange. Nice thing about that is that's up online and accessible to whoever wants to request it. So we're trying, one of our following initiatives is to get as much of our data as we can on there. So a lot of it's, like I said, already on there and can be requested through Nature Accounts. We've done also comparisons. So we've used these multi-method models to compare the detection rates from ARUs and playback and even different data processing methods of ARUs. So we've kind of honed in on what we think are the most effective methods for processing the backlog of ARU data that we have and that the province also has from other projects. So that's something that we've contributed to the province to help inform their work with that. And then Megan has led a pilot and capture and tagging study to help inform territory size, range overlap, and fine scale habitat use, which should also inform the occupancy models, population densities, and population estimates, and hit some of those key boxes in the recovery strategy objectives. So next step, there's some additional playback survey data to add to Nature Counts. We have more like I said, a backlog of ARU data to work through. We don't, whereas we've got all the data from the playbacks, we've got nature counts. We don't really have a system in place for sharing the ARU data. Wild tracks is an option that Birds Canada uses, so that's something we're considering. And yeah, we want to run, once we get these data processed, the rest of the ARU data, we have sort of models set up and ready to go to help test some of these hypotheses, some of the speculation that I laid out there for what habitat features are working for screech-owls and maybe protect them from barred owls. And this will help us better compare and track occupancy rates across habitats and over time to characterize factors that affect detection probability, like if barred owls, and we have seen lower detection rates of screech-owls, so lower vocalization rates in areas where they overlap with barred owls. But that's something we could get some more quantitative data behind and have, some statistically significant or not results. So that's something we're looking to do, and also ultimately providing habitat association data to help inform critical habitat designations. So those are still forthcoming, and yeah, there's draft versions that we're hoping to provide information from. So we've already provided a bunch of data and occurrence records from these old growth habitats, which I think should already help inform the critical habitat, but we're interested in using these occupancy models as well to assess habitat associations, as they include a lot of the null detection data and detection probability information, which I think will help inform those habitat designations. Okay, ramble complete. Yeah, back to our friendly little owl chick here to make us all feel warm and fuzzy again.